Thanks for joining me. In this video, we will cover unwrapping optionals. In the previous video, we saw what an optional was. So now we will extend our optional type that we created to see how we can unwrap it. And then we will cover what Swift gives to us in the forms of an if-let, a guard-let, and also nil coalescing. Let's start by implementing our unwrap method within our optional that we started in the last video. So we have our optional enum, and we want to unwrap the value that we set. So we can do so by creating this unwrap method, and then we can switch on our self, and our self is the enum that has the case sum and the case none. So if we switch on our self, we know if our optional is sum or none. So we can say case.sum. And then our case takes in a type of t. So here we're just going to say whatever that type is, we're going to name that variable x so that we can use it within this case statement. So we can say case.sum let x, and then we can just return x. And this will return whatever value is x. So in the case of our optional, when we pass in hello, we are setting the self equal to .sum with a value of hello. So when we call this unwrap method on our optional, it will switch on itself, look for case.sum with the value of hello, and it will return hello. And then for the case of .none, this should never happen, so we will just call a fatal error. So now let's test this out. Let's go down to our optional string, and we can say our optional string dot unwrap, and let's set this equal to a value. So let string equals our optional string dot unwrap, and we will take a look at string, and we can see that it is a string now instead of our optional string, and we can see over to the right here that it is the value of string hello. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that too much. There's other ways of unwrapping these optionals within Swift. So let's go back down to our person type, and where we have var full name string with the return of given name, middle name, and surname, we can do some unwrapping. But first, let's change this middle name. Instead of nil, let's change it back to a value. In my case here, I will change it to James. And then when it prints out, it'll print out the optional of James. So let's first take a look at if-let unwrapping. So we can say if let middle name equals middle name, and then we can access that middle name as a property. So we're creating a new variable here called middle name, and we're setting it equal to middle name. And this if here is saying if this middle name here has a value, then set it to this new let constant that we created called middle name. So we could name this anything. So let's clarify it a little bit, and we're saying middle name unwrapped equals middle name. So middle name is the optional, and we're saying if there's a value, set it to middle name unwrapped. And then in here, we will use our middle name unwrapped. And now this is a string instead of an optional string. But we still have to return something outside of here. So we can say return our given name, which we have to do the string interpolation. And then we can do our surname. So if there's a value, we're going to unwrap it and return the entire name. But if we now pass in nil instead of James, it will just return given name and the surname, like so. But there's another way to unwrap, and that's with the guard let. So let's change this back to James. And let's, instead of doing the if let, we will do the same thing but with a guard let. We will say guard let middle name unwrapped equals middle name. And then if it fails, we put our else statement here and return our given name and surname. And then if it passes, we can return our full name. And in this case, I prefer guardlet because the purpose of the guardlet is if we need to exit early from whatever we are doing, we can do so with the guardlet. Whereas the iflet, if we have a series of different properties that we're setting and we only need to unwrap something for that particular property, it might make more sense to do like an iflet inline, because we're not caring about exiting early. But in this case, if middle name does not have a value, then we want to exit early by returning the given name and the surname. But if middle name does have a value, we want to continue with our code. So here we just have an extra D here, and that's why it's failing. So again, this works the same way. If we now pass in nil, we have the same results. So in this case, we can still do one step even shorter, and we can remove this guardlet, and we can use the nil coalescing operator. So the nil coalescing will take an optional value, in this case middle name, on the left-hand side, and then you have your nil coalescing operator. And if middle name doesn't have a value, we can give it a default value of empty quotes. So now, in this case, we have our middle name of empty quotes, which looks weird because we have these two spaces, and notice there's these two spaces here. And then instead of nil, we can put in James. And since middle name now has a value, it's going to use that value of middle name instead of empty quotes. Stay tuned for the next video where we will cover creating and calling functions.